Hello folks, my name is Chuck Guggenson and I'll be your study mate for this semester in MS627. Welcome to the class. Look forward to hearing your thoughts and reflections on this fascinating topic of public theology. I must say this has been an area that I'm very interested in and have been for some time. The intersection of Christian faith on the one hand, public policy on the other, and political engagement on the third, where those three things come together, I think is fascinating. And it's an area that I think has far too little attention given to it in our current theological education and the whole process of thinking through theology, though I do think that's starting to improve. So I'll say a little bit more about the particular parameters for this particular course and where we'll focus our studies, but in general, the topic is public theology. And here's how I put it sometimes. If we as Christians are engaged in the gospel of Christ, a gospel which at the core is supposed to impact every aspect of how we live our lives in the world, then there isn't any part of that life that we can ignore. There isn't any part of our life together that we can set to the side and say, well, this is unimportant. We don't have to worry about this as Christians. Well, we do, because the shalom that God intends for us, how He intends us to live together and enjoy each other, is very strongly impacted by the kinds of public policies and institutions that we have in place. So let me begin by giving you a little bit of introduction to myself. I would like for you to do what I'm about to do, except do it in typing rather than doing a video post. In the discussion center, one of the first things I would like for you to do is introduce yourself. Tell us a little about yourself, tell us a little about your ministry setting, what sort of ministry you're shooting for, where you live. I'll tell you a little bit about myself. I adjunct at a number of schools. I've written a number of books. I do some consulting. I'm a teaching pastor at a very multicultural local church here in Lexington. My wife and I have been married for about 35 years. Actually, we'll be 35 years this April, and we have a daughter, Sarah, who's 27. She is a pediatric nurse at the University of Kentucky. I am a lifelong learner, and I'm always looking for some new thing to take on, and my latest new thing to learn was how to fly. So I have a private pilot's certificate as of a couple of summers ago, and I'm working on an instrument rating at the moment. I'd love to run, though I haven't been doing as much of that lately as I used to, and so that gives you just a little bit of an introduction to me. Use that as a model, expand, don't really make it much shorter than what I just did, but tell us anything that you'd like for us to know about you. You know, if we were all together on a geophysical campus, we'd be able to go to lunch together and sit and have a conversation and get to know each other a little bit better. Here online, our chance to do that is in our introductions to each other and our dialogue together. So I want to make sure that we get off to a good start. Tell us a little about yourself. Post those, of course, in the discussion center. Now, the second thing I'd like to do is spend some time going over the syllabus for this particular course. I like to go over it. We'll flip through it page by page pretty much, though I'm not going to read every single page. You see the course description there at the beginning. Introduces students to the growing field of public theology with an aim to make application to the complex, multifaceted issues associated with how sin distorts God's creaturely goodness, affecting personal, socio-cultural, and systemic entities alike. We will be focused particularly on issues related to taking public theology from a missional perspective. We'll have to talk about some common definitions, if we were just doing public theology here in the U.S., but as we think about what it means to engage in missions and to keep public theology in mind, that's the particular niche that we'll want to focus on. And it'll cause us to ask some questions around things like globalization, health and economics, what sorts of financial structures, what sorts of development practices in developing parts of the world allow the shalom of God to be best spread as we come in as ministers of the gospel, or as we come in to participate with those who are already ministering in the gospel. Public Theology for Global Development, that's the title of the course, so that names the focus there. Please feel free to read through that and ask me any questions you have on the introduction and the course description. Student learning outcomes, I'll read through those with you quickly. 1, explain the nature of public theology with appreciation of how it can help buttress some of the traditional ways of approaching theological discourse. How does it serve the broader theological task? 2, critically evaluate the relevance of theology for global issues, specifically examining the role of faith and belief within the field of development studies. Third, examine implicit theological truth claims within specific public domains. I'm going to leave that fairly abstract right now, but what it means quickly is as we think about how the life of faith plays itself out, what sort of impacts does that have on our public life together as well? 4, generate original research in public theology for engaging in one specific aspect associated with global development. That'll become clear as we talk about the assignments here in a minute. And then additional student learning outcomes. You might be able to, well, I shouldn't say might be able to. Our goal is for you to be able to describe seminal contributors to the field of public theology and how they made their mark on this, in the growth of this particular discipline. Under course requirements, first thing you see are the required readings. We will start with Public Theology for a Global Society. That I will lecture a little on that today to get us started. Vinath Ramachandra's book Subverting Global Myths will be another one, and then Miroslav Volf's book A Public Faith, How Followers of Christ Should Serve the Common Good. Instead of Volf, you could read this one by Brueggemann, Truth Speaks to Power, and then select one of the following, March's Development as Freedom, and Collier's The Bottom Billion, Why the Poorest Countries Are Failing and What Can Be Done About It. There are some listed here as recommended as well. I'm not going to go through those. You can read them. Let's talk now a little bit about assignments. Assignment number 1. This is an online course, as you well know. And so for online courses to be successful, I have to be able to count on you to complete the assigned readings and then to engage in discussion with each other. I will say more about what the nature of that engagement with each other should look like in just a minute. So assignment 2, 20% of the course grade, by the way, is on that first piece, the engagement piece. Assignment 2, each student should choose one source of public theology and analyze its theological claims, inclusive of truth statements, implicit meanings, and values and implications for influencing people, how people look at themselves. Sources can be from electronic media, novels, books, newsprint, and so on. Paper should be limited to 3,000 words, and that's 20% of the course grade. Assignment 3, a theological evaluation of economic development. Each student will write a 1,500-word essay critically reflecting upon one of the implicit themes in Collier's The Bottom Billion or Sin's Development as Freedom. And then finally, assignment 4 is the final research paper. Now this is about 6,000 words, or not more than 6,000 words. That's probably about 15 pages, so let's say 12 to 15 pages if you want to put it in terms of pages. A final research paper will explore a specific facet of public theology as it relates to global development. The paper should be limited to 6,000 words. Students should demonstrate an ability to find, treat, and analyze some particular sphere of public discourse related to global development, engage in a robust theological treatment of the material, and make firm application for one specific cultural aspect of global development. We can talk about that more as we go along. If you have any questions about any of these assignments, of course, raise those in the discussion center here this first week as well. So again, assignment 1, that is the regular participation in the online course, is 20%. Number 2, this theological analysis piece is also 20%. The evaluation of economic development, one of the 2 books that we mentioned, is 20% also, and then 40% for the final project. The grading scale is listed here as well. Now, class agenda I've identified by week, and what I owe you yet is the required reading or activity. I did not put those in there. I do have when the assignments are due, however, the ones that, 1 is ongoing, but 2, 3, and 4, they're listed there for when they're due. And I will, by the end of the first week, have the version of this class agenda with the readings for each week. As I said, we're going to start with Public Theology for a Global Society, this particular one here. So get started reading in it, and if you read through the first half or so in the first week, that will stead you very well. The rest I think is mostly, stuff needs to be looked at, but it's some is boilerplate from seminary language. Then there's the appendices, which are identifying rubrics for how I grade the papers, what kinds of things I'm looking for. And then there's a supplemental bibliography that's listed here at the end as well, which covers a number of additional texts that you might use for the course. Okay, and I think that covers the syllabus. Now, as I said, I am sure that as you get into reading through the syllabus, you'll find some things that you want to ask me questions about. So please be sure to do that. Back in the discussion center, just raise any old question that you want to. If we were on campus and you wanted to raise a question, you just hold up your hand and I would recognize you and you could ask it. Can't exactly do that here in the online setting, so I count on you to use the online discussion center as a way for you to be able to raise any questions that you might have. Now let me go into a little more detail about online course expectations. Number one, each week I will post, probably every week, maybe there may be one or two that I don't, but most weeks anyway, I will have a YouTube video like this particular one for you to watch. I try to keep it to about 20 minutes, which means they run about 30 minutes as a general rule, and since I'm doing all this introductory stuff today, it may be just a little bit longer than that. I will usually post those sometime on Monday, and I'll give you all of Monday and some of Tuesday to watch that, and then of course to have read through the material for the week. On Tuesday, at the latest Wednesday morning, I will post a set of discussion questions. There will be as few as 3 and as many as 10. Usually they'll come the day after the posting of the video. So if I post the video on Monday, I would probably post questions most frequently on Tuesday. That should be the normal expectation. As I said, there may be cases where it gets posted on Tuesday and questions on Wednesday, but you get the idea. Of those questions, generally about 3 of them, sometimes 4, I will put in bold print. The bolded ones are the ones that I want you to bring back to the discussion center and to discuss together. Now, I said that 20% of the grade was related to your regular and substantive participation in the online discussions. What I mean by substantive participation excuse me, is that you would engage with a post of at least 100, well, let me say at least, about 150 words, plus or minus just a little bit. 2 to 3 of those each week. Sometimes that response that you post may be specifically in response to a question that I ask, one of those bolded ones. But I also want to make sure that at least half, and I wouldn't mind if more than half of your answers come in threaded discussions to each other. If I open up the discussion center and what I see are, let's say there's 20 students in this class, 20 different students answering each of the 3 questions like you're answering them back to me, then we won't have achieved the kind of interactive dialogue that we need for the course to be successful. So those 2 to 3 posts per week, if you get on and it's Thursday, say you get in on Thursday, Friday, a little bit later in the week and there's already good discussion going, don't feel like you have to start another thread answering my question. Just jump in and make a substantive contribution to one of the existing threads. Minimal case would be I'd get online and there's only 3 threads where all of you are answering and interacting with each other on the 3 questions. Now I don't expect that'll be the case because there will be some times when one of you will want to take a very different angle on the question than everyone else has, so you'll start your own thread. But I just want to stress the fact that interacting with each other in answering the questions is important, not just to answer it for me to see if you understand the material. And then of course the little short posts of encouragement to each other are encouraged as well. One more thing on posts, please only answer 1 question per thread. Every semester I have a few folks who will copy all the questions, post them in one thread, and then type their answers in between. So when you go in, you see one big long post that's got an answer to all the different questions on it. Please don't do that. It creates a lot of confusion. You see, what happens if you answer a whole bunch of questions in one post and the next person gives an answer and the next person answers, and before you know it, we're unclear who's answering which question and who's responding to whom. If we keep each thread focused on one particular question, then there's a reasonable amount of coherence and we have a reasonable ability to understand our responses to each other, and it doesn't become too confusing. If you make a mistake and post it in, where you post all the questions and answer them, I'll just respond to that thread by saying, please only answer 1 question per thread. Complete all the assigned readings, and recommended readings are not required, but they're there in case you want to supplement your reading. I will perhaps, I don't guarantee you that I'll do this, but on occasion in the course of discussion or in the course of our reading, something will come up in the contemporary news, or I'll discover an article online that I think relates particularly well to the topics we're discussing. When that happens, I may post it and ask that you read it as well. If you add it up in the whole course of the semester, it won't be much, so don't worry, it won't increase the assigned readings by much, if any at all. And then finally, assignments are due by their due dates. Please submit them online. Do not email them to me. I will have one of the links will be an upload, a link for you to upload your assignment in the course discussion center as well. If you email them to me, then they get separated from everyone else's, and when I'm teaching multiple courses, as I am this semester, it becomes very easy for them to get separated from each other, so please don't let that happen. Post them in the discussion center. Now notice that the due date is the due date. I almost always try to put, let's say the paper was due next Friday, which would be the 14th. If I would put under the due date, and when I set it up for you to be able to submit materials, I'll put due date the 14th. But I'll probably put the latest date that I'll accept a paper a few days later. That doesn't change the due date. If it doesn't meet the due date, it's still late. But what I'm trying to do is inevitably someone gets online and they forget about it, they got the assignment done, it's midnight, and they, I was supposed to turn in a paper today, and they get online and it's a few minutes past the deadline. Well, if I make the last day to submit the same as the due date, then you can't submit it online, and you have to email me, and we have to figure out for you to get me the paper. So I always put or at least assuming I remember, I try always to put the latest date which I'll accept a paper as some period of time, few days anyway, past the due date, just so you don't have to come chase me down if the paper is late. Please, if the paper is going to be late and you know that it's going to be late, be sure to let me know that in advance. Okay? Advise me. Let's work out a slightly different due date based on whatever your specific needs are. Okay, that covers the syllabus and the basic outline of my expectations for this course. I think we'll have a lot of fun together. As I said, this is a subject about which I care a great deal, and I'm very interested in seeing what contributions you make to our discussion. Let me begin. We'll keep this first week, I hope, relatively short, but I want to make something of an introduction to the topic. First of all, what is public theology? Well, public theology isn't just when you get outside and start talking about theology, nor is it a theology just about public things, but the best way to describe it, I think, is what I said to you already. The gospel intends to impact every aspect of our lives. God has some say over how we live together. He has images that he shows us, I think, in Scripture for how we're supposed to live together. Public theology asks that question: how is it God intends us as a community, as a society, as a world to live together? And how do we make sure that public policies and institutions are in place in ways that enable us to live together the way that God intends? Why is so little attention given to the topic of public theology? Well, my guess is that in the West in particular, we tend to be very individualistically focused. From the Enlightenment on, it seems to me that we've had, at least in the West, a very individualized understanding of our existence. It's very easy to go to the other extreme and have an overly communal understanding of our existence as well. I understand that both those errors are possible, but I think right now we tend to be on the individualistic end, so we don't really think too much about public life together when it comes to what are the theological implications for that. I had a friend once ask me, he said, "Chuck, why in the world, of all things, are you wanting to study philosophy?" And I was trying to think of a way of answering that question to him that would help make the point without just getting defensive. And so I said something like, because the philosophers and theologians are the ones who set the thought categories for how we understand our lives. That didn't make very much sense to him. And I said, well, let me come at this a different way. You're a post-Kantian thinker and you don't even know it. And he said, I'm not sure what you mean by that. And I said, tell me what it means to be a person. And his definition of person was a very individualistic one. He said, well, it means to be an individual. It means to pull yourself up by your own bootstraps, to be on your own. It was a very, American, Western understanding of what it means to be a person. And I said, yeah, I understand. That's a very popular way of understanding what it means to be a person. But really, that degree of individuality is only about 300 or so years old. It's a relatively modern development. If you had asked a first century Jew what it meant to be a person, they would have answered in communal terms. They would have said, well, it means to be the son and daughter, or son or daughter of so-and-so. It means to be playing this kind of role in the community. In other words, the understanding of person would have been much more focused on the communal aspect than on the individual aspect. And so I was trying to make the point to him that the philosophers and theologians are the ones who, intentionally or unintentionally, tend to set up those categories by which we define ourselves in our life together. It just so happened that that example also makes this point about individualism. I think also our whole understanding of what it means to be saved, what does salvation include, has an impact on how we think about issues related to public theology as well, and how easily we overlook them. If we think of salvation as a purely individualistic thing, me and Jesus, then our tendency will be to overlook issues of public theology. But if we understand salvation to be God's restoring us to the kind of communities that He intended, then we have to ask the question, what do those communities look like, and how ought life in those communities be structured? So I think partially the problem with an inadequate degree of attention to public theology is our rather anemic view of what it means to be saved. Well, then, of course, the whole issue of what's communal and what's personal, I think that comes up in this as well. And I think that we have to recognize the role of the community in forming us as the people we are. We like to say, I did it on my own, for example, in our individualistic cultures, but that's just never the case. We grow up in families where we have or don't have particular kinds of opportunities. We have friends and relatives who shape and form us in our interactions with them. I think the number is like 95% of the people who are born into a particular religion stay in that religion their whole life long. The context in which we live has a huge impact on who we become as persons. So the idea that we can somehow separate ourselves from our communities is mistaken. And as soon as we recognize the intimate connections we have with our communities, the more we're inclined to recognize how much issues of public theology have an impact, even on our personal lives of faith as well. What role do public institutions have in the life of faith is a question I think we've often overlooked, but one that we have to think about. Given that there is a role that public institutions play, inevitably in the life of persons, we have particular laws and rules which establish particular values and so on, and those impact how we live together. So the question you have to ask is, how can we, as followers of Jesus, as adherents to a gospel which, as I said earlier, changes everything about our existence, how can we not care about public theology as well? The question, of course, is fair to ask, and it's hinted at in one of the essays in the beginning of the book that we're reading for this week, is can you really do public theology in a day when civil religion is all around us? That is, given the extent that religious life and civil life have become intertwined, how is it that we do public theology? Well, let me say it a different way. I think in America in particular, what it means to be a Christian and what it means to be an American in the minds of many people have become so intertwined that you have a really hard time of separating those things. And so when Americans decide that they're going to respond to God's call to become missionaries, the first thing I think they really have to do is ask themselves, how do I go as a missionary of the gospel of Jesus and not a missionary of American/Western culture? Those things get conflated in our minds so closely that I think it's really hard for us to separate them out. And then finally, there are many different ways to come at these questions of public theology. You can come at them from a global missional perspective, which is where we're going to focus, but there are also a variety of other ways. You could come at this largely from a political engagement standpoint. You could come at it from the standpoint of academic theology, just thinking through these categories, or you could come at it as an activist theologian, where you're trying to actually help encourage particular kinds of social change. But our focus is going to be on a global, missional, developmental perspective. Let me take a look at some of the definitions of public policy that we see in the book that we're reading for this week. First of all, on there's 3 points on pages 4 and 5. First, public theology is theologically informed discourse that seeks to be understandable both to those within its own religious tradition and to those outside it. In other words, if it's going to be a public theology, it's understandable to the public as well as to just other believers. Second, public theology is concerned with issues, institutions, interactions, and processes that are of importance and pertinence both to the church and other religious communities and to the larger society, including those of different religious traditions or even those who have no religious tradition at all. And then finally, the third one, public theology makes use of sources of insight, terminology, and forms of discourse and argument that are in theory available and open to all, in addition to ones that are explicitly religious. Right? And so we engage not just in a explication of the Bible, for example, and converting it directly into public policy, but we have to, in recognizing that we're engaging this task in the public square, we have to engage in argument forms and thought forms that can be persuasive to those outside our community of faith as well, even though it may well be driven by commitments we have that are faith commitments. There are three ways of viewing it, as they talk about on page 11 and 12. First, some who write about public theology do so by providing descriptive and interpretive accounts of theologians, clergy, and others. That is, recognizing those who've made the kinds of contributions. Second, another group of writings about public theology is produced by those who are primarily concerned with clarifying what public theology is and how it ought to be done. That is, they're more methodologically focused. How do you do public theology? And third, others are interested in public theology and they concentrate on constructive efforts, descriptive accounts, and normative proposals with respect to the issues, institutions, and interactions of public life. So you have the study of public theology in that you study historical development through the people who've done the work. You look at it methodologically, secondly, or thirdly, you look at it more from a perspective of, let's call that the pragmatic focus. How do you actually institute change based on your findings in public theology? We'll be doing a little bit of each one of those things this particular semester. Now he talks on page 15, I'm not going to get into this, but he talks a little bit about why public theology and political theology are not exactly the same thing. The short way of saying it is this: public theology deals with a broad range of things, not just political engagement and the political process, whereas political theology is focused more specifically on political processes and institutions and so on. So public theology includes considering issues of public theology, but it isn't limited just to that. What is the basis for a good public theology? Well, in my book, Christians in the Common Good, which I debated putting it as an alternative for you to read to one of the ones that you're reading, but I actually required it in another course. If you take MS627w1 with me, we read it there, so I didn't want to have it show up in a couple of different places. But in that book, I argue that the whole question of public theology and political theology has to be put on a different basis than it's commonly placed, than it's commonly rooted. The question can't just be, is there a biblical, or what is the biblical role for government, or something like that. The question has to be, and by government I mean public policies, institutions, all of that. The question has to be, how does God intend us to live together? God has created us for community. He's created us to interact with each other in particular ways, and I think he paints a pretty clear picture of what that life looks like in Scripture. We see it in the nature of God himself. I talk about this some in the book. In the incarnation, God is a missional, sending God, in that he comes to us rather than calling us to, to simply come to him. And then the nature of that incarnation, the self-giving love that's exhibited in the life of Christ. And then if we go through Scripture, and in the book I do about 20 or so biblical vignettes from Genesis all the way through pretty much to the end of the Bible, trying to show that there is a consistent picture of how God intends us to live together. Lives of mutual interdependence, that is, we're not independent from each other, we're not dependent on each other, but we're mutually interdependent. We're to live in communities of love, and that love is to be characterized by love of enemy and by willingness to give ourselves for the benefit of others, to sacrifice our own interest for the other. That's a like a 2-minute summary of 165 pages or so, that where I try to go through this in more detail. But I think a basis for public theology is in asking, how is it that God intends us to live together? In our book for the week on page 32, I think you get something similar to that when at the end of that paragraph after the long quote, these enduring moral laws of the Bible must lie at the foundation of the positive law of any modern Christian polity. That is, if we're going to think about how to live Christianly, then the sorts of moral pictures, the moral narratives that we get from Scripture have to give us some sort of guidance into what that means. How does God intend us to live together? What role does Christian faith have in determining the answer to the questions that come up in public theology? Well, I think we have to think about that in a couple of different ways. First of all, let me say it a different way. There are at least 3 or 4 different ways that people have thought about the answer to that question. The first one is, the Bible is a rule book and it tells us what to do. So you read in the Bible and you apply that directly. There are some movements in the country. I can think of the Reconstructionist or Dominion movement. I think are ones that pretty much want to take the laws of Scripture and put them into practice today. Be worth going into a little more detail about that, but I'm not going to at the moment. Second one, the Bible provides guidelines and principles even if it does not address every particular issue. So the first one simply says, take the biblical principles, convert those directly into law. The second one says, not so much converting them into laws, but into principles, because we have to recognize that there are lots of things that we face that never come up in Scripture, and so what we have to do is get principles that help us to develop answers. Third, it'll be obvious that this is kind of where my sympathies are. The Bible provides a narrative that paints a picture of the life that pleases God. Our goal then is not so much to extract principles or laws as it is to be formed by a narrative that makes us into a particular kind of people and then guides us to form communal associations and societies in a particular way. And then finally, there's the view that says the Bible really doesn't tell us very much about it at all. We have to develop skills such as statecraft. They may bear some resemblance to the biblical narratives, but not in a particularly significant or inherent way. And there are Christians, by the way, who fall into all of these categories, particularly on war questions around war and peace. I've heard the last one appealed to, Scripture doesn't really tell us very much, and so we just have to, we're left on our own to sort of make our best prudential judgments about what statecraft and the relationship between states ought to look like. What sorts of topics fall underneath the area of the public theologian? Well, here, let me just name a few. These are not exhaustive by any means, but it gives you an idea of some of the different things that would come up in the course of studying public theology. Family life. What is the norm for the family, and what is it that helps families to flourish? How do we decide what constitutes the normative family, if you will? Second, judicial and legislative questions. What is justice? I mean, according to Plato, justice was everybody getting what they deserve. Scripture, if we take it for granted, as I do, that God's justice and His love are not opposites but are somehow reflections of the same thing, then God's mercy has to somehow be connected to His justice. And the fact that He gave His Son for all of us, that is, the fact that we all get better than we deserve, says that somehow biblical notions of justice aren't quite consistent with what Plato had to say. But so what kind of laws are just? What constitutes justice, and what kind of laws are just? Third, economic issues. What constitutes a just basis for the economy? How will limited goods be justly distributed? Are you going to do that in some centralized fashion, some distributed fashion, some let the chips fall where they may sort of fashion? And how will those on the margins, how are those poor, those who don't really have access to the levers and of power in society, how do those folks get tended to? How do we try to make sure that they have a voice? Fourth, development. How are underdeveloped areas addressed, and what sort of theories and practices, not just one or the other, empower people to flourish? Businesses. What obligations attend businesses as they form in societies and as they move from one location to another? What obligations do they have to local communities, and what do just labor laws look like? Environment. Given that the global environment is very much interconnected, and that our whole protection of of our species, if you will, the continuation of the human race, depends on how well we tend to the environment. You can see how easily questions around what does environmental justice look like, how do you balance care for individuals and care for the environments in which we live as well. War and peace are public theology issues. Under what conditions might two peoples go to war, and how do you make judgments about all of that? And of course there are others. I'll leave it to you to expand the list. But what you can see is that every aspect of human life matters to God. Maybe not whether we have chocolate or strawberry ice cream for dessert, but you know what I mean. How we live together, how we structure economies, I don't think these are things that God's indifferent about. That's not to say there's only one that's acceptable to Him either, but there are certain ends, it seems to me, that God has in mind in terms of, particularly, as I've said repeatedly now, how we're supposed to live together. That, I think, lays the groundwork for what constitutes public theology and how we think about it. That's all I wanted to say to you this week. Just get into the discussions of what constitutes public theology, how we might think about it, what sorts of areas it might cover. Work your way through this book for the first week, and like I said, by the end of the week I'll have I'm still making some judgments about exactly how to best line up the reading material and if I had my way, you'd probably read it all first and then we could have the conversations that we're having, but of course it doesn't work that way in a semester. So I'm still going back and forth a little bit on that. Sorry to take a little while to make a final decision, but I'll have that for you by the end of the week. But again, focus on public theology for a global society for this first week, and that'll get us moving along. I'll post discussion questions for you in the next day or so, and look forward to hearing your thoughts. By the way, go ahead and start now giving us your introductions. I'd like to hear a little bit more about each of you. Thanks. I'll see you again soon.